Much like every good horror villain, I'll always come back for a sequel. Welcome back, Dram Fam. No, hated that as soon as I said it. Please don't adopt that ironically. Anyway, as the spookiest time of the year once again comes into full effect, what better way to celebrate than with your third or fourth favourite talking skeleton? And on that note, celebrate we shall, as it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, new and old, to Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season. As always, I'll be your host, Dan Drambles, and can I just say it is genuinely good to be back in the bones. I am so excited. Because this month, we're going to be breaking down some of the biggest slasher icons of all time, covering every entry into their original franchise continuity, good and bad, with a new video every single day. And as is always the case with Wholesome Halloween, we'll of course be looking at these movies through the lens of celebration, and wherever applicable, finding the humanity in the horror. This is day one, and what better way to kick things off than with the debut feature of one of my favourite horror icons of all time, Freddy Krueger, in Wes Craven's 1984 masterpiece, A Nightmare on Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street was dreamt up, pun absolutely intended, by Wes after he read a few rather grim real-life stories about refugees fleeing war suddenly dying in their sleep after experiencing particularly horrible nightmares. In the documentary Never Sleep Again, he explains one story that struck a particular chord revolved around one young man who was trying to keep himself awake at any cost, hiding sleeping pills his parents had given him and keeping a coffee machine locked away and hidden in his cupboard. The film mercifully didn't straight up adapt these actual real life tragedies though, and instead just used them as loose inspiration to tell an interesting little boogeyman story that meshed the vibe of urban legends with fantastical horror visuals in order to explore heavier subject matter, while also making a damn creepy little film that proved so successful it spawned a franchise that basically laid the foundations to take a small little struggling independent film studio that employed very few staff to an industry powerhouse that would go on to create some of the biggest films of all time, including the multiple Academy Award winning Lord of the Rings film adaptations. Needless to say, Nightmare was a good move for everyone involved. So much so for New Line Cinema that the studio is often called the house that Freddy built. The film follows Nancy Thompson, whose best friend Tina is having terrible nightmares of being chased by a disfigured man wearing a clawed leather glove. While already a frightening image for the young woman, she finds herself particularly terrified by these occurrences because elements of the dreams seem to bleed into reality, like when she awakens after having been slashed at by the man and her nightgown appears cut in real life. Terrified of what might happen if she falls asleep alone, she asks our main character Nancy and Nancy's boyfriend Glenn to stay with her while her mother is out of town. That night, when the three are having their sleepover, Tina's boyfriend Rob joins them. When Tina falls asleep, the disfigured man taunts her in her dreams before attacking her once again, but this time, she isn't so lucky as to wake up. In the real world, Tina's body thrashes wildly in terror, waking up her boyfriend, who witnesses her flesh become cut as if attacked by an unseen force. As she continues to struggle and bleed, she begins to levitate around the room, slamming into walls and screaming for help before being slammed unceremoniously and lifeless back onto the bed in what I believe is still to this day one of the most impressive and effective on-screen deaths in a horror movie. With seemingly no one else in the room at the time of her death, Rod gets the blame for Tina's murder, but Nancy is certain he's innocent, especially after she falls asleep in class and is taunted with haunting visions of Tina's body and attacked by the same disfigured man Tina once spoke of. Now, with her friends being picked off one by one, her parents ignoring her cries for help despite repeated evidence of the killer existing, and her own life likely next on the kill count, it's up to Nancy to figure out what the hell is going on, find out who this mysterious killer is, work out a way to defeat him, and all while keeping her eyes open, because a single dream could spell her death. Now, I wanted to open Slasher Season with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise for a couple of reasons. One, I bloody love this series. It might be my favourite of all the ones we're going to cover this month. And this first film is a particular high in what is already one of the most consistently good slasher franchises there is. And two, the term slasher gets a really bad rap. And I think this film is a great counterpoint to that reputation. Last year, during the first Wholesome Halloween, I set about to shatter some unfair preconceptions about the horror genre. Which, by the way, if you're new to the channel, congratulations, you got like 5 hours of some of the best content I've ever done to catch up on. Now go watch it, for God's sake, please, these things take forever. There is an understanding of horror in the public consciousness, especially amongst those who do not actually consume it, that it is a somewhat cheap, tacky, or even at its worst, immoral entertainment. Films made only to thrill, scare and shock in a quick disposable manner, employing either loud noises or exploitative scenarios and violence to make a quick buck off the back of the bored Friday night teens audience. Now, while some films in the genre could certainly be considered to fall into these gratuitous failings, it's hard to argue these days that horror is without value. While obviously that statement was literally never correct, it would raise a lot less eyebrows in the past. Now, however, horror is having a real rebranding moment, with Hollywood making a concerted effort to work with new emerging talent as well as already celebrated creators to produce high-budget features releasing to both critical and commercial acclaim. And with the advent of new production companies and studios who specialise in exactly this, horror has a lot less stigma. We're moving away from the days of straight-to-DVD torture porn and camp creature feature rubbish and seeing the dawn of a time where horror releases, more often than not, sit comfortably alongside other genres in best of the year list. And on a personal level, I hope that even if you are not aware of this change in perception occurring within the genre, that if any one of you watched the first Wholesome Halloween, you can see that there can be a real heart to it. That the genre can be empowering, it can be socially conscious, it can be a safe way to explore and tackle darker issues, or it can just be fun. General audiences are slowly starting to wake up to this idea, and while there's still a little bit of stigma and presumption amongst people who don't consume these films as to the value of the genre's contents, that stigma is definitely lifting. Slasher films though, I'm not sure they ever kicked that sour taste. Often seen as horror's red-headed stepchild, side note, I'm allowed to say that phrase by the way for anyone new to the channel, as I am actually ginger, this is just black spray paint for the costume, the slasher got a really bad rap. You have to realise that if horror was once difficult to stand up for, trying to preach the value of horror's uglier, more cynical, more violent, less thematically inclined younger sibling was, and arguably to some extent still is, an almost impossible task. Slashers were the genre of truly cynical nihilism, of bodies and brutality, of blood and bare breasts. Acclaimed film critic Roger Ebert famously called these films dead teenager movies, and was known to be particularly cynical when it came to them. In his review of Friday the 13th Part 2, he stated, "About 24 movies a year feature a mad killer going berserk, and they're all about as bad as this one. Some have a little more plot, some have a little less. It doesn't matter." And Ebert was not alone. Almost all critical analysis of these things seem to return with the same sentiment. This stuff is trash. And that was the overriding sentiment across the board. And I'm not knocking these critics. Some of them had a lot of genuinely meaningful critiques about how these films dealt with violence against women, and there was the occasional praise between all the think of the children noise, as even notorious slasher hater Roger Ebert was known to celebrate the very occasional slasher movie when it was truly too good to deny, such as he did with the original 1978 Halloween film. I'm only saying that amongst some of the fairer critiques and the very occasional praise, that the general consensus was an almost genre-wide belief of, this is violent misogynistic garbage, 0 stars, please bin it forever. An entire subgenre tarred with the same brush. And it wasn't really until 1992, years after slashers had peaked in massive popularity throughout the 80s, when Carol J. Clover wrote the Bram Stoker award-winning Men, Women and Chainsaws, a cultural critique on the depictions of gender and the appeal of slasher and horror films, that we really had any meaningful academic counter-argument to the whole ban this sick filth narrative. And to make a long story short, This is why I think it's only apt that I open this slasher season with A Nightmare on Elm Street, because despite being the debut feature of one of the most iconic slasher villains, despite the title alone being synonymous with the slasher genre, and despite the fact that Freddy Krueger is literally on the very first displayed image when you Google slasher films, A Nightmare on Elm Street is undeniably so much more than just a dead teenager movie. This is an incredibly interesting film. There is actually so much to be said about Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm not even sure where to begin with dissecting it. You honestly could write a whole book on this first movie alone. It is not just an accomplishment on an entertaining level, but it is rich in themes and subtext. It's full of, still to this day, unmatched levels of technical wizardry, and it features some brilliant characterization, not just in its incredibly memorable villain, but also in its protagonist Nancy, who is in many ways the proactive antithesis to the image of the cowering girl in the corner waiting to be killed that so many people mentally associate as being synonymous with the slasher movie. This was a celebrated movie, and rightly so. It wasn't just a financial success, but a critical one too, at a time when likely some of the same critics that were singing its praises were in almost the same breath deriding slasher movies as garbage. It's almost kind of mind-blowing to me that we ever really had a period of time where we as a collective consciousness wrote off the slasher subgenre in its entirety, when films like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, John Carpenter's Halloween, and A Nightmare on Elm Street all existed and were celebrated, and we did not see the cognitive dissonance in that. What happened there? In the end though, it doesn't matter. The ultimate point is, regardless of your preconceived notions of the genre, Nightmare on Elm Street is an excellent film. Not just an excellent slasher film, an excellent film. And that isn't because it surpasses its genre limitations or anything like that. This isn't an elevated slasher, if you will. It's just a slasher. And it turns out that slashers can just be this good. The first thing you notice about Nightmare on Elm Street when you watch it back now is just how incredibly well it holds up. Despite some very occasionally wonky effects here and there that show both its age and its budget, the vast majority of it still looks and feels spectacular. There are scenes within this that no Elm Street movie after this one, hell, no horror at all, will even come close to the level of emulating. Comparing sequences side by side to its contemporary remake really shows just how ahead of its time it was. Obviously, it's no controversial statement to say the 2010 remake was bad, but it's a testament to the original film's level of ingenuity in its approach to effects work that 2010's effort doesn't really even come close to achieving the same level of quality, despite having nearly 35 times the original's budget. Tina's death, floating and spinning chaotically above her bed, would be a notable highlight in a film made yesterday. And Nancy's chilling first nightmare of her friend being dragged by an invisible force in a body bag is the kind of movie magic you'd expect of something on the 10 million plus budget at this time period. Never mind something working with only a tenth of that. Its eerie dreamscapes and the way it plays around with the rules of reality create a villainous force the likes of which horror audiences have probably never seen before. The deaths aren't just a quick, thoughtless cut of a sharp tool being slammed into the nearest victim in a manner that dispenses the quickest and largest amount of blood. They're these incredibly crafted, well thought out and darkly imaginative surreal ordeals. By creating this character unconfined by the restraints of realism, Wes Craven was able to craft a villain who could surface in all these unsettling and invasive ways. It felt fresh, it felt new, but most importantly, it felt important to the story. Slashers often deal with a twisted subversion of the pleasant and the benign. Whether it's turning a fun summer camp into the site of a horrific massacre, or invading the quiet suburbs of middle-class America to wreak havoc on the white picket fenced-in nuclear families of the Reagan era, setting is always extremely important. I would argue this is never more apparent than in A Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, the very setting is so important to this story, it's part of the title. You see, Elm Street isn't just any particular street. It's a nice street. A pleasant street. The kind with smiling neighbours and kids playing out in the yard without fear of strangers. But it's a street that's built on lies. In my opinion, A Nightmare on Elm Street's greatest strength is in one of the tiny twists it does on a standard horror trope. You're all familiar with some form of the trope I'm about to describe. Something supernatural or out of the ordinary happens, but when our protagonists seek the advice of adults or authority figures for help, no one believes them. so they have to handle things themselves. It's a very common plot point. Sometimes it's even the entire premise of movies, as is the case with films like Summer of '84, Rear Window, or the latter half of Candyman. I even briefly used this in my own film, The August Club, where a kid's recounting of his encounter with a vampire goes unbelieved, and then again in a film I co-wrote called Dog, where the suggestion of contacting the police about a werewolf is shot down before it's even attempted. It's a very familiar recurring device. But the thing is, with A Nightmare on Elm Street, the adults know the kids are telling the truth. At least in the sense that they know Freddy Krueger is a real person, but they choose to ignore them anyway. And it's this little element, which feels like a small touch, but I think actually really highlights a lot of what Elm Street is really about, that often I think goes underexplored. You see, Nancy's mother is a really key character in discussing the film's themes. When kids start dying left, right and centre, she begins to noticeably drink more. And even though she clearly knows more than she's letting on, she just keeps insisting to Nancy that it's just bad dreams and it's all in her head. And this line of argument persists even after she takes Nancy to a sleep clinic and witnesses firsthand Nancy physically pull Freddy Krueger's hat out of the dream world. And it is only after being grilled by her daughter and after having seen this indisputable evidence of Freddy's presence in Nancy's dreams, having again witnessed her physically grab an item of his possession out of nowhere, that she very reluctantly admits to knowing about Freddy. She explains that Fred Krueger used to be a child killer on Elm Street, who got off on a technicality when a search warrant wasn't filed correctly. Enraged at the injustice of it all, the parents of Elm Street, Nancy's mother included, took to more vigilante methods to see Fred's crimes paid for, and burned down his home with him in it. Hence Freddy's whole aesthetic with the burnt skin design. Now notable as well is even after reluctantly admitting this, Nancy's mom is still very much trying to sweep things under the rug, insisting that Freddy is dead, and she knows he's dead because she killed him. That's enough for her, please just stop talking about it. She doesn't want to know how her daughter knows who Freddy is. She doesn't want to know how Nancy and all of her friends have vividly described seeing the same man. She still doesn't want to talk about the hat she just watched Nancy pull out of nowhere. Just shut up, it's done, he's dead, let's never talk about this again, ever. Just think about what Wes Craven is saying here with that. It's not just Nancy's mother who knows about Fred, it's all the parents. Everyone their age was presumably a part of this, and they all just moved on and never mentioned it again. And then when their sins of their past come back on their kids, they just don't want to entertain it. Because ultimately, it's just too difficult a conversation. Let's just drink away our problems instead. Lock them up, hide them away. Let's not talk about the boogeyman today. What does that say about Elm Street and by extension the many streets of middle-class America that are just like it? It feels to me like Wes is trying to tackle this illusion of pleasantness. The idea that this perfect little picturesque middle-class American image is just bullshit. That it's all built on one big lie. That we'd rather keep up this smiling, attractive facade of charm than address any deeper rooted issues. Craven was always a big critic of the Reagan-era mindset and the inherent unfairness and falseness at the root of his middle America. You only need to look at his darkly satirical 1991 effort, The People Under the Stairs, which I covered last Wholesome Halloween, for definitive confirmation of that. But long before his 1991 efforts had a caricature of the man himself running around in a gimp suit, Freddy was already tearing away at the facade of pleasantness that so much of the American dream was based on. You know, Freddy was supposed to have been a child molester as well as a child killer, but that was taken out of later scripts. However, the sexual undercurrent to his violence is still very much present in the subtext. Instances like the claw in the bathtub, the fact he doesn't bother with the adults that killed him but chooses the victims to be their young children, the whole coming into his victims' bedrooms at night, it's very there, even if it's not explicitly stated. The 2010 remake would re-add this plot point in and make it just pure text and not subtext, but I think that fundamentally misunderstands the greater idea behind the original movie. Regardless of the reason for the sexual violence themes to be cut in any overt reference from the script, the end result is stronger specifically because it is there in subtext and not overtly spelled out. Because that's what Freddy is about. That's what the themes of the film are about. As a monster, he represents the unspoken, the things people are uncomfortable addressing, and would rather hide away from. The Freddy Krueger of the original Nightmare on Elm Street could very well still be a sexual predator. After all, he certainly acts like one. But the parents who killed him are reluctant to even talk about him at all, and only admit he was a child murderer with extreme pressing. Do you think they'd ever dare talk about what else he might have done to his victims? Of course not, because this is lovely Happy Elm Street, where we don't talk about dirty, nasty, awful things, regardless of if they're happening on our doorstep, regardless of whether we're in any way involved with them. Freddy represents the darkness that lurks underneath all the Elm Streets of the world. All the marriages failing behind closed doors, the violent abuses, the horrifying murders that happen 3 doors down that no one wants to talk about because it ruins the neighbourhood's lovely image. Freddy as a creation is this marvellous creature that symbolises all of the things wrong, hidden in the cracks of the places that pretend everything's right, that jumps out at the audience and says, I'm here, you can't ignore me. No matter how much you drink, no matter how much you pretend I'm not there, I'm always here. I'm literally always on your mind. I'm in your subconscious. Smile all you want to your neighbours. They don't know when you sleep at night. You dream of me. You dream of your problems. And that alone would make him an astounding concept that, when paired with the creative ways in which they handle his presence as an on-screen villain, could easily, just on these 2 things, carry the whole movie. But there are still so much more good things to talk about. I have not even mentioned how perfect Robert Englund is in the role of Freddy. It's not uncommon in slasher franchises to cycle actors for who plays the killer, but believe it or not, they actually tried to do this for Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and gave the role to a stunt performer, and it just didn't work. They filmed 2 weeks with the guy before they reluctantly admitted, we can't do this without Robert. And thank God they weren't stubborn in their decision, because you can see it as early as this first film. Robert is Freddy. He has this menace all his own, the way he carries himself, how the weight of his gloves shifts his stance, how he runs, how he speaks, how he articulates and expresses the joy in his terrorizing. A lot of slasher villains are specifically created without a personality in mind. So many are these mute, masked murderers. And while there's certainly a value in that, their unclear motivations and unflinching personas can be a terror all on its own, but Freddy is a full-on character. You absolutely get a sense of the kind of twisted individual he is. There's a grotesque playfulness about Rob's performance, and I think it's only because of him that Freddy works, even when he gets campier as the films go on. He can switch between horrid and hilarious on the fly. And although this first film sees him at arguably his most menacing, the building blocks are there for the one-liner spouting dream jester still to come. And Heather Langenkamp as Nancy is the absolute perfect foil for him. Another problem slashers often run into, and you'll see a lot of this in some of the titles that crop up this month, while the villains might be memorable, the heroes often aren't. Heather does not have this issue at all though. She's brilliant, an absolute standout character in the so-called final girl trope. She's brave, she's smart, she's resourceful, she's constantly an active participant in the plot as opposed to someone the plot just kind of happens to. She does not mess around. Less than halfway through the movie, she's already reading old army books on how to set up booby traps while she plans on bringing Freddy to the real world. She is the polar opposite of the damsel in distress stereotype audiences may anticipate from this kind of film, and it feels completely natural. Plus, she's just a good actress. The rest of the cast aren't bad either. I particularly like John Saxon's turn as Nancy's dad, Sergeant Thompson. He turns in a great performance as a tough as nails, no-nonsense kind of guy. But there's something beneath the surface that portrays a great tiredness. I don't know if it's just me, but something about him comes across as uncertain and frightened despite his cool composure. Like he's carrying a huge burden. Which of course, he is, as he's in on the whole town's dirty little secret. It's great stuff. But then again, so is everything about this film. With the exception of a slightly janky ending with a wonky mannequin special effect and a rather cynical closing point that feels at odd with the prior victories of the film's heroine, it rarely ever misses the mark. And even the ending, to be honest, I can kind of forgive, as Wes didn't even want it in there. He actually wanted a happy ending, but a final, somewhat rushed scare was added at the studio's insistence. But you can almost ignore this bit really, especially since Wes kind of got the chance to unwrite this ending anyway when he brought back Nancy for part 3, effectively retconning this final scene that seems to allude to her suffering an unfortunate fate. Other than that though, it's just incredible. Like, make no illusions, this is a horror masterpiece. From its tense, moody opening where we see Freddy craft his iconic weapon, the film grabs hold of you and just never lets you go. Its central conceit of the killer having power in his victims' dreams creates a first viewing experience where the audience can never feel safe. Due to the surreal nature in which the film drifts between reality and the dream world, you can never be certain for any scene whether the characters have fallen asleep and are constantly in fear of sudden tone changes, as any scene could be a nightmare waiting to reveal itself. It also gets bonus points for cleverness in having the only slasher villain that can effectively taunt and attack you in real life in the same way he does in the movie. After all, I'm sure many people saw a Freddy or two in their nightmares after this. Honestly, I think the film would still be pretty scary today if not for the metatextual problem of Freddy's overexposure. The guy is basically a theme park mascot these days. It's unfortunate that as a result from his cheesy sequels, he just got this kind of MTV rockstar treatment where he was like everywhere. When I was growing up, I knew exactly who Freddy Krueger was and what he looked like without ever having seen a Nightmare movie. They say you should never show too much of the monster in a horror film, and while I don't think the film itself falls into this overexposure trap, it doesn't change the fact that Freddy Krueger has a rap album. I mean, come on. It's really hard to fear the bogeyman when you can get bogeyman branded pajamas, isn't it? If you're watching it for the first time though, don't let that put you off. Sure, Freddy might not be too scary these days, but it doesn't change the fact that this is a smart, well-crafted, thematically rich, strongly acted, and incredibly well put together piece of horror. Just seriously, if you haven't watched it, please do yourself a favour and do so. Aside from Freddy's overexposure and the only very occasionally rough-looking practical effect, this film hasn't aged a day, and it is infinitely better than its more contemporary reboot/remake. If you have even a passing interest in horror, you owe it to yourself to see this thing. And bang! How do you like that? That's one slasher deep dive down and only 30 more to go. Oh, why did I think this was a good idea? Well, whatever, I'm here now, and so you might as well stick along for the ride. Next up on the channel, we'll be covering and defending the somewhat divisive Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Until then, make sure to subscribe to my Only Dans at the red button below so you don't miss it. And also, like if you enjoyed the video and comment with your thoughts. And finally, if you're feeling really generous and would like to get some cool exclusives, then you can support the channel by becoming a patron at the link in the description below. Until then, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you again tomorrow. Until next time, Dramily, no, Dramily, oh god no, oh, that's so much worse. Oh.